The world's most expensive military couldn't understand one simple thing. How could a country famous for tea, rain, and old soldiers possibly have created the hardest selection course on Earth? By 1980, America's elite troops had earned their reputation the hard way. They had fought in Vietnam, led long-range patrols through jungles, survived firefights that lasted for hours. Many arrived in Britain wearing decorations that proved they had already faced death, and won. So when they stepped onto the grounds of Hereford, they weren't intimidated. Some even smiled. To them, the SAS looked almost old-fashioned. Smaller, quieter, less impressive than the massive American military machine they had come from. One ranger reportedly joked that Britain could keep its tea-drinking commandos. They'd be back home before anyone noticed they were gone. The British instructors didn't argue. They didn't defend their reputation. They simply handed over a map, a compass, and pointed toward the dark outline of the Brecon Beacons. No speeches, no motivational briefing, no promises, only one instruction. See you if you make it back. Over the following days, something unexpected happened. Men who had passed some of America's toughest military schools began disappearing from the course. Not because they were weak, not because they lacked courage, but because the test wasn't measuring strength. It was measuring something they had almost never been asked to prove. The SAS weren't trying to discover who could run the fastest. They wanted to know who could keep making perfect decisions after exhaustion had destroyed confidence, after isolation had erased motivation, and after every logical reason to continue had disappeared. The mountain didn't care about rank. It didn't care about medals. It didn't care how famous your unit was. By the end of the exchange, the Americans left with something far more valuable than a certificate. They left with a lesson that would quietly reshape the future of American special operations and help define the philosophy behind one of the world's most elite counterterrorism units. Because sometimes, the greatest weakness isn't physical. It's the gap you never knew existed. This is the story of how the SAS exposed that gap, and why even America's finest had to rethink what it truly meant to be selected. By the late 1970s, the United States had already built some of the most capable fighting units in the world. The war in Vietnam had been brutal, costly, and deeply controversial. But it had also produced a generation of soldiers with real combat experience. Many had survived years of jungle warfare, long-range reconnaissance missions, helicopter assaults, and close-quarters combat. Among them were men from the Rangers, the Green Berets, airborne units, and specialized reconnaissance teams. They had operated under enemy fire, called in artillery while surrounded, and completed missions where failure often meant death. From the American perspective, combat was the ultimate test. If a soldier had already proven himself in war, what more could a selection course possibly reveal? Across the Atlantic, however, the British 22 SAS viewed the question very differently. To them, combat experience was valuable, but it wasn't enough. Because war is unpredictable, selection had to be predictable. The SAS believed that before a man could be trusted on the world's most sensitive missions, he first had to be placed in an environment where there was no enemy to blame, no squad to hide behind, and no luck to rely on. Only then could instructors discover who that person really was. This philosophy had been shaped over decades. Since the unit's founding during the Second World War, the SAS had developed a simple but uncompromising belief. Under extreme pressure, people don't rise to the occasion. They fall back on their habits. Selection wasn't designed to create elite soldiers. It was designed to expose weaknesses that ordinary military training often failed to reveal. That difference fascinated one American officer more than anyone else. His name was Colonel Charles Beckwith. Years earlier, Beckwith had served on exchange with the SAS. He watched British operators approach selection with an intensity unlike anything he had seen in the US Army. The course wasn't obsessed with speed. It wasn't obsessed with muscle. And it wasn't interested in impressive personalities. Instead, it quietly asked a far more dangerous question. Can this person still think clearly when everything inside them demands they quit? Beckwith never forgot what he witnessed. In his memoir, He later described the SAS as one of the finest special operations organizations in the world, not because of better equipment, but because of the extraordinary standards used to choose its people. That experience stayed with him for years. Eventually, after the growing threat of international terrorism and the lessons of operations like the failed Operation Eagle Claw rescue mission in 1980, the United States began investing heavily in a dedicated counterterrorism force. Many of the ideas that shaped that unit traced back to what Beckwith had observed in Britain. But before those lessons could influence America's future, another group of confident American soldiers would arrive at Hereford believing they already understood what it meant to be elite. Within days, the mountains would prove otherwise. The first surprise wasn't the weather. It wasn't the weight. And it wasn't even the distance. It was the silence. Most elite military courses build confidence through teamwork. Soldiers encourage one another, share the burden, solve problems together, and move as a unit. Even when the training is exhausting, there is usually someone beside you. The SAS deliberately removed that advantage. After the initial phases, candidates were expected to navigate alone across the Brecon Beacons, a landscape of steep hills, bogs, thick fog, cold rain, and endless open ground. There was no instructor walking beside them. No teammates to correct a mistake. No radio conversation to keep the mind occupied. Only a map, a compass, and the next checkpoint. On paper, it looked simple. Walk from one point to another. Repeat. But the simplicity was deceptive. Every decision belonged to the candidate alone. Choose the wrong ridge, and you could waste an hour. Miss a checkpoint, and the entire day might be lost. Push too hard early, and your body could fail before the hardest climb had even begun. The SAS instructors understood something that many military organizations were only beginning to appreciate. Exhaustion doesn't just weaken muscles. It changes the way people think. Research in military psychology has repeatedly shown that prolonged fatigue reduces attention, slows decision-making, and increases confidence in incorrect judgments. A tired mind often believes it is making smart choices, even when it isn't. That was exactly what the selection staff wanted to expose. They weren't watching for dramatic failures. They were watching for small ones. Did a candidate stop checking the map because he felt he knew the route? Did frustration replace discipline? Did confidence become carelessness? On the Brecon Beacons, those tiny mistakes accumulated until they became impossible to recover from. This is why so many experienced soldiers struggled. Combat had taught them courage. Selection demanded precision. Combat often rewards bold action. Selection rewarded patience. Combat can sometimes forgive a mistake because teammates cover it. Selection offered no such safety net. Many Americans arrived believing their greatest strength was experience. Instead, experience sometimes became a liability. Men who had spent years trusting instinct occasionally ignored the careful navigation that the mountains demanded. Others tried to attack every climb at maximum pace, only to discover that the course wasn't testing who could move fastest. It was testing who could still move correctly after hours of physical and mental punishment. The instructors rarely needed to raise their voices. The mountains did the teaching. One poor decision led to another. Confidence slowly turned into frustration. Frustration became self-doubt. And once self-doubt took hold, every hill seemed steeper than the last. By the time candidates approached the legendary Long Drag, the final endurance march carrying a heavy Bergen over more than 60 kilometers of unforgiving terrain, they finally understood what the SAS had been testing all along. It had never been a hiking competition. It was an examination of judgment under relentless pressure. Because the SAS believed that on a real mission, the man who makes the right decision after 20 hours of exhaustion is far more valuable than the man who runs the fastest during the first hour. And for many of the visiting Americans, that realization came too late. The mountains had stripped away every badge, every past achievement, and every assumption. All that remained was the individual. And that was exactly the point.